there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere or sometime along an indefinable line between the reasonable and the highly unlikely? Makeshift Stories presents a monthly journey into the improbable.
This month's story, 152, The Challenge. Somewhere and sometime, if you are taunted by a competitor, be clear about their motivation before you act. Ezra looked up into the dark Prussian blue sky. CO2 scrubbed and color-tinted perfectly to reflect the straw poll of the day. He breathed in the thin air, then opened his neuro and biometric interfaces. More than 1 million minds flooded in hungrily, reveling in his adrenaline, anticipating his next step, the imminent danger, the initial release, the thrill, the fear. All experiential opioids more addictive than any chemical. Another million jacked in to join the first, his eyes, ears, and body now shared by more than his last 5 stunts combined. He checked the heads-up display in the right corner of his vision and watched the numbers climb as he artfully dragged the tension out, letting the fear and apprehension creep in. His thigh muscles almost cramped as he compressed his legs, readying for the jump. He held the position like a cat ready to spring at a bird. Then, with an ear-splitting yell, he jumped. For a brief second, the bird suit kept him level. It was mostly for show anyway. Then he and 3.5 million others felt his stomach lighten and turn to jelly as gravity took over and sucked him down. 2,000 meters below, the jagged rocks rushed up toward him. Ezra watched the altimeter click down. 4 million minds felt their lizard brains panic, but urged him not to stop, not to deploy the parachute. A flashing red line began to slide up his vision. When it reached the midpoint, he had to release the specially made parachute and hope the custom cushioning devices would be enough to keep the G-force from breaking his bones and ripping joints. Push through the boundary, relish the adrenaline and fear, love the moment without thinking about the future. The idea resonated in his mind and took hold, forcing everything else aside. 20 million minds now urged him on. The release point alarm began to wail in his head, the gear screaming at him to save himself. Ezra listened to the crowd and basked in their adulation. The red line moved past the marker. Dressed in the expensive clothes the hotel had lent him, Ezra sat at the bar nursing a drink, watching the breakers roll in and the genetically tuned bodies of the oligarchy frolic in the waves. The beach was vacuumed to perfection, and the reef filters, too far out to be seen, made the water artisan clean, as long as you weren't too close to one of the elite's diapered toddlers, who hadn't yet figured out the difference between the ocean and a palapa-roofed baño. Eventually, the coastal filters would return all the oceans to a pristine state, but that would take generations.
"Can I get you something else, sir?"
The automated barkeeper interrupted.
"Sure, another margarita would be great."
Ezra almost added thanks, but why thank a machine for doing what it was designed to do? Ezra couldn't get used to being treated this way. He should be grateful, but there was still a stubborn core of resentment somewhere in him, which officially had been engineered out of the plebeians like him generations ago. The 95% on the wage were engineered to be happy and complacent. Life was safe and relaxed in the commons where people like him lived. The wage gave everyone just enough to live without too much strife. Really, it wasn't so bad, he rationalized, especially when one compared life in the commons to the historical record for most of the world's population. Since the accommodations a century ago, basic needs were looked after, and the plexus neuronet allowed anyone to connect with anyone else and share their experiences. Ezra had been born in a northern commons, but the ambition he was not supposed to possess had quickly encouraged him to do more than just connect on the plexus. His virtual sharing of dangerous acrobatic stunts had set him apart, made him a star in the commons, a phenomenon that was not supposed to exist, yet did. So far, the elite had tolerated a limited few like him to continue, because their antics didn't strain the commons' resource allocation. His fame is what had earned him invitations to places like La Quebrada, to entertain the oligarchy their way, face to face, something most could only dream of. No one in the commons could afford to travel. The famous Acapulco cliff had been rejuvenated and recently artificially raised to a near impossible height. Then, daredevils like him invited to entertain the guests. Only 3 years ago, at 15, Ezra wouldn't have even dreamed places like this still existed. But now he was here, feeling the warmth of the tropical sun and the soft breeze of the Pacific Ocean gently caress his blotchy olive skin. As a commoner amongst the gene-modded royalty, his physical imperfections made him stand out. Even though he was considered handsome in the commons, Ezra felt like a toad here. But he was the entertainment, and apparently his diminutive physique enhanced the act for this select audience. Ezra downed his drink in a single gulp, then ordered another. Out of the corner of one eye, he caught a gene-modded man with Greek god-like proportions, watching him from the other side of the pool. In comparison, Ezra was just skin, tightly stretched over bone. Everyone in the commons had the same caloric budget, so his added physical activity tended to keep him a bit too gaunt. He tried not to notice as the man gracefully sauntered around the pool, then casually positioned himself one stool over. "You're Ezra, the daredevil, right?" he ventured, revealing his showroom teeth in a calculated smile. Not wanting to give the stranger the deference due to a member of the oligarchy, Ezra sipped his new drink before responding. "And you are?" Ignoring the insolence Ezra had displayed, the man introduced himself. "I'm Orion. Orion Duffield, Archduke of Nuevo Acapulco." Ezra knew the family name. It was one of the elites that made their fortune during the Great Collapse in the previous century. Many had since bought peerages. "I'm a big fan," the Archduke continued. "I followed your rise on the plexus. But I'm surprised by your physical stature. You're a lot smaller than I imagined. I suppose it makes sense. It's hard to tell what is ego or real when you experience things through an entertainer's senses. Don't you agree?" It was not the first rebuff Ezra had endured from a member of the oligarchy during this gig. He took an immediate dislike to this man. Ezra searched his memory to see if he remembered this guy being in his head. It was rare for a member of the elite to seek lowbrow entertainment on the commons plexus.
I'd remember someone like you, unless you were slumming behind a commons persona.
Orion just smiled. "Good luck tomorrow. I had to rearrange my week to be here. I trust this will be worth my time. Enjoy your drink." Orion got up and left, leaving Ezra feeling a bit rattled. He wondered why a Nueva elite would bother with him. Was it some type of new game at his expense? Dive day was far from perfect. Wind gusts blowing offshore had ensured the conditions would be unpredictable. Even with flawless technique, an unexpected gust could blow a diver into the razor rocks which ringed the bottom of the inlet, or into the rock walls on the way down. Word appeared to have gotten around the resort. With the added risk, more had shown up on the viewing terrace than the hotel's management had anticipated. Servitor robots were busy stealing chairs from the nearly empty lounges to accommodate the unanticipated crowds in less than ideal seats, making many of them angry. Ezra watched the scene with disdain and checked the clock. 3 minutes to go. Ezra stepped up on the diving platform and opened his neurobiometric interface, newly upgraded by the resort's owners for the enjoyment of their privileged guests. The crowd was flowing in, but was smaller in comparison to the plexus, although they would enjoy higher fidelity and the full range of biometrics through exclusive channels in the new interface only they could access. They would also be able to switch between Ezra's and their own senses. Ezra looked at the program director, who checked her handheld screen, then nodded. He moved intentionally slow and methodically toward the end of the platform. It had been raised at the last minute at the request of the Archduke. The platform was now at the maximum height, based on the depth of the water at equilibrium, from which a diver could survive. A depth which was only theoretical given the constant waves which surged into the narrow inlet. Timing would be critical, and that was the point. Ezra would be the first to try from this height, a new record for cliff dives, and was a bit sad his Commons fans would not be able to access the live stream. A gust of wind rushing out to the ocean to be sucked into the large cumulus clouds in the horizon brought Ezra's attention back to the moment. Diving was all about concentrating on the moment and timing. The time it took to fall to the water, the time it took a wave to fill the inlet, and enough time between the unpredictable wind gusts for both to happen. Each gust pressed against his body, forcing him off balance like a sailboat in a storm. Ezra could feel the excitement of his audience grow as they felt him teeter. They were here to be amused by the stunt, but equally, many wouldn't mind seeing and experiencing a nobody from the Commons shredded by the rocks on the cliff walls. Those were the minds getting the most excited by the wind. Ezra took his time preparing, dragging out the tension, jacking up the biometric feed sensitivity for fear and adrenaline as he waited for the moment. He concentrated on the waves moving in and out of the inlet 100 meters below, counting, burning their rhythm into his mind. At the same time, out of the corner of one eye, he watched for movement in the palm fronds on the resort roof, hinting at a coming gust of wind. He breathed in, then stepped to the very edge of the platform, so his toes stuck out into the abyss, then balanced there, waiting, his and the audience hearts pounding. A sudden thought pushed into his mind from someone in the crowd and distracted him just as a gust of wind hit. His interface was supposed to stop that from happening, but he didn't have time to consider how they had evaded the block. The wind shifted his center of balance in an unexpected direction, and he found himself involuntarily falling forward off the platform. A headfirst dive would kill at this height. The audience sensed his terror and grew excited in response. Ezra pulled himself together and allowed the slow rotation to continue, hoping he could time it, so he would be feet first when he hit the concrete hard surface of the water at 150 kilometers per hour. But there was a second problem which might make his entry a moot point. The wind had forced him off too early. He was out of sync with the cycle of the waves. He could see the water below beginning to recede. The height, speed, and time to water flashed in his visual implant. He would be a fraction of a second too late. The crowd in his mind was hyper-excited in anticipation of the impending accident. He ignored them, and in a frantic maneuver twisted 90 degrees, so his body was perpendicular to the wind, hoping the waning gust still had enough energy to nudge him out just a meter or so toward the inlet opening. When he hit the granite surface of the water, his body wasn't quite vertical, so his head and shoulders were slapped so hard he felt like he had been hit by a bat, and he struggled to keep conscious. He cringed in anticipation of being slammed into the rock bottom of the inlet, but his feet never touched, and instinctively he began to swim up. As he broke the surface, he could feel the disappointment of those in the audience hoping for a violent end to the stunt. Then the crowd began to disconnect. Ezra had just pulled himself onto the pier when he noticed that people had gathered back around the cliff's edge. Another figure had casually mounted the platform, walked to its end, and simply stepped off. It wasn't elegant, but the timing was perfect, and whomever it was hit the crest of a wave. The applause was louder than Ezra had received. When the figure surfaced, Ezra finally recognized the man. It was Archduke Duffield. Despite being upstaged by the Archduke, the resort surprisingly honored the rest of their agreement with Ezra, allowing him to stay for an extra 2 days at their expense. He was sitting at the pool bar enjoying the rarity of the experience when Orion, uninvited, sat down beside him. "Hey, daredevil, I beat your record," he boasted in an oily, arrogant voice.
We dived from the same height. I was the first,
Ezra said without turning to look at the oligarch. After risking his life for their entertainment, he wasn't about to kowtow to one of them, even if that person had attempted the same stunt. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about the height. I beat your audience numbers on the plexus.
Ezra turned to stare at him in disbelief. But this was an exclusive gig. It didn't stream to the plexus.
Your dive didn't, but mine did.
Orion smiled predatorily.
People like to be surprised. They don't want to know how things turn out. Everything else in their little worlds is predictable, predetermined, so they love the vicarious thrill of watching someone risk their life. Will the daredevil survive one more time? The rush is addictive, right? That's how you built your following. It's what made you famous in the commons. But you're an oxymoron, Ezra. No one is meant to stand out in the commons the way you do. The plexus is there to distract, not make superstars. So I've been watching you, watching your audience. It really wasn't hard to figure out.
He leaned back in his chair and laughed.
One stunt, and I've bested your numbers. You'll be history soon, and the commons can get back to doing what it does best. Nothing.
Ezra sat there, stunned, his face turning red. Why would you bother to do this? He raged. You've got everything, even people like me from the commons to amuse you.
It's part boredom and part necessity to restore the natural balance. Have you ever been bored, Ezra? People like us need a challenge. You obviously need more than the wage, and I need more than wealth. But commons people are not supposed to want more, so you are a dangerous anomaly. I wanted to meet you and let you know that I'm going to take you down. The commons will love me more because they all want to see an elite buy it. And I have the resources to go higher and do riskier stunts than you could ever afford.
But,
Ezra began to protest. Let's be honest for a moment. The accommodations which make the commons possible, well, let's just say that neither side have ever been happy with the situation. Despite our heavy investment in genetic engineering, you still secretly resent us. And we don't see the need for you at all. I mean, really, you're a drag on the economy. We have to devote nearly 10% of the world's resources to sustain the masses and get nothing back in return, except for some momentary distraction from the likes of you. And that was okay, until your audience hit critical mass. Too many are learning how to share a common experience. And that is the basis for collective ideas, and ideas eventually lead to action. That is not how the plexus was meant to be used. It needs to stop.
Orion leaned forward, menacingly close to Ezra's face.
I'm going to be so famous that I will overload the network and take the plexus down, peasant.
Ezra could smell the alcohol on his breath, but didn't give ground. He struggled to keep calm. He didn't want to show this aristocratic jerk how rattled he was. So instead, he pushed his face so close to Orion's, his spittle sprayed the other man. Next stunt, I'll blow you away so badly that even your arrogant friends won't bother streaming you. Orion suddenly dropped back into his chair and laughed.
Wow! A commoner with a spine. Bartender, I want to buy this guy a drink. Whatever he wants.
The Archduke got up and left. Ezra ordered a bottle of 200-year-old French wine, the most expensive thing on the menu. When it arrived, he opened his biometric interface, allowing his fans in, then poured the ruby-colored wine, gram for gram more expensive than plutonium, onto the ground. Ezra woke with a headache. He had taken full advantage of his last day at the exclusive Acapulco enclave before security bots had carted him to a train station in a nearby commons, and now he was in coach, stiff from a night on a bench. It was a far cry from the jet they had brought him down on. It would take a week to get back to the northern commons where he lived. He looked out the window at the recovering tropical scrub. In many places, he knew the environmental rehab would be generations before it firmly took root. The recovery was the result of the accommodations 100 years before, when everyone finally had to admit the world was finite, and the environment was on the verge of collapse unless something was done. The solution was the commons, where everyone received just enough calories to exist and just enough resources to keep clothed and housed, but nothing more. The commons had dramatically reduced the human footprint on the planet, allowing the world to recover from the excess of the past. However, not everyone belonged to the commons. A very small percent became the oligarchy, and in theory, they were in charge of the recovery. So, whenever Ezra had the opportunity, he made sure he overindulged. Ezra watched the world crawl by outside until he was thoroughly bored, then turned on his implants. The plexus was ablaze with the news. Orion, an obscure member of the oligarchy, was streaming a jump from the apogee of a suborbital flight. His numbers were already well beyond anything Ezra had achieved. The guy was right, he conceded. The commons really did want to witness an elite risk death, and most would be hoping he lost. Ezra's first impulse was to bail out of the feed, but curiosity and anger kept him there. He could see the curvature of the earth and the darkness of space through Orion's eyes, and felt his stomach rise into his throat when the Archduke jumped, and felt the fear and the exhilaration as gravity took hold and clawed him down. Ezra noticed the audience numbers climb, then drop off when it became obvious that nothing was going to happen. At such a great height, there was almost no sensation of speed. Orion had broken a 250-year-old record for highest jump, and that initially attracted the audience. But they weren't there to witness a record. They were there hoping to see an elite turned into bug splatter on a rocky plain. Ezra was shaken out of his thoughts by a DM from Orion. "Only 2 jumps, and you're already half buried." When Orion began to hit the thicker part of the atmosphere, the audience could feel the dive suit heat up, but their numbers had dropped below a typical Ezra stunt. Orion pushed a thought into the plexus. "I'm going to delay deploying my chute." The safe release altitude came and went. The audience numbers began to quickly rise, soon tripling Ezra's best. Like Romans watching a gladiator, Ezra could feel the commons egging Orion on. The elite finally pulled his chute at an impossibly low altitude. It shot out of his backpack like a flame, then inflated, jerking up so hard that Ezra could feel the pain through the plexus. Then Ezra knew what his next stunt had to be. 100 million people were now sharing his senses, 10 times more than Orion or any other stream in the history of the plexus. Like a raging brush fire in a drought-stressed field, their adrenaline burnt through his mind and body, making him feel invincible. He could do anything, and would. 10, 15, 20% past the release point. The audience numbers kept growing and growing. Orion had lost. But the designers of the plexus had never planned for this scale, and as the counter edged towards 250 million, its overtaxed hardware began to break down. As his audience dropped away, Ezra was surprised to discover Orion at its epicenter, encouraging the crowd. He was laughing and DM'd, "Thanks for taking it down." The overtaxed feed went dead, leaving Ezra alone with the rocks rushing toward him like the open mouth of an angry shark, and the realization he had been duped by Orion into destroying the plexus. Ezra frantically checked the altimeter and watched it blur past the 65-meter mark, well beyond the limits of his gear. He yanked on the release and screamed. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB Financial. To listen to other great APN podcasts, such as I Have Some Notes or Not There Yet, please head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com.
Learning is a lifelong process. More and more people are finding themselves returning to college or university mid-life to change careers, update their knowledge, or pursue new opportunities. Returning to the classroom after several decades can be a daunting but rewarding experience. Follow Katrina Ingram each month as she chronicles her personal journey and the stories of other midlife learners who are currently enrolled or have recently completed a post-secondary program. Back to School Again is presented by Norquest College and is an affiliated member of the Alberta Podcast Network. Check out Back to School Again at backtoschoolagain.ca. Makeshift Stories is released once a month between the 15th and the 20th. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell Tew. Opening and closing music was composed and recorded by David Hume. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. You can help us out by writing a review on Stitcher Radio or Apple Podcasts or any of your favorite podcast services. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivative license, which means that you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.